Hi, everyone, and welcome to the weekly edition of the School of Public Health's noon meeting. This is our weekly academic meeting. It's being hosted this week by the Division of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, which is why I'm speaking. And we're particularly excited this week to have a topic that I've been trying to get Elizabeth to do for a while. So we've found the slot to do it on Mseleni Joint Disease. And I'm excited about this, and there's a good turnout in person, so I think it reflects collective excitement, both because of the condition, but also because of the method. And the condition you'll say more about. Mseleni Joint Disease is like an urban, not a legend, but like a rural legend in South Africa. This sort of well talked about but poorly described endemic condition. And from a methodological perspective, I'm excited about it because there was a time when epidemiology was different. Epidemiology today is like this highly quantitative science, and people are obsessed with p-values and variances, structures, and covariance matrices and things. Very analytic and quantitative. 100 years ago, epidemiology was this interdisciplinary undertaking, which was really driven around solving, answering questions, persistent questions in public health, and would draw on whatever set of methods was most relevant to answer the question at hand. And the best example for me from now almost 100 years ago is the discovery of pellagra, the causation, the etiology of pellagra as a nicotinic acid deficiency was done by an epidemiologist working with social scientists and community, as what we would now call community health workers in the rural American South, in a very multidisciplinary sort of mixed methods way. And so I'm particularly excited 100 years later to see someone who wouldn't necessarily describe herself as an epidemiologist, but this is fabulous epidemiology. And so, Elizabeth, we're really looking forward to your talk. Elizabeth is a recently graduated PhD student from human biology with a background in forensic anthropology, forensic science, clinical anatomy, and biological anthropology. And we're really looking forward to hearing your discussion, which I understand is, Vicky, part of your broader sort of body of work on Mseleni Joint Disease. So 30 minutes for a presentation, and I'm sure we'll have great Q&A.
Thank you so much, Prof. Hello, everybody, and thanks for such a great introduction. So by a show of hands, who's actually heard of Mseleni Joint Disease before this date? Okay, great. Okay, so it's a small group. So which sort of speaks to the bigger problem here is that this is a disease that is currently endemic to South Africa, disables a lot of people, but very few people actually know about it. And so the title of my talk today is Exploring the Etiology of Mseleni Joint Disease, a Mixed Methods Study. And I just also want to add a disclaimer that, like many people's PhD, my PhD journey was not linear. I had bold plans of generating a stem cell model in the lab and testing genes, and COVID happened, and so we pivoted to something that actually looks more like a mixed method study. So it also speaks to the fact that research often changes and develops through time. So what is Mseleni Joint Disease, and why are we interested in this condition? So Mseleni Joint Disease, or what I'm going to refer to as MJD in this presentation, is endemic to northern KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. So if you look at the map, you'll see North South Africa, that dark part highlighted up there. And it's been detected as far north as the Mozambican border, but we do think that there might be a bit of sampling bias linked to inter-border healthcare not being very well reported. And it's also lodged between an area that's flanked by the Umbobo mountain range, which is just past Pongola River marked on the map, and then between a set of coastal dunes that's found just before the ocean, the Indian Ocean. So it's in this little geographic area that this disease has been found, and we don't really understand why. We don't understand why it exists only here and why it only affects people in this area. So it's isolated to people of Zulu language and Zulu culture who are endemic to this area. And also important to note that this kind of pathology is also not being detected at other hospitals other than obviously the ones in this area. So it's not that we are maybe not reporting it or detecting it correctly. So there's been a lot of work and no genetic or cultural singularities have been identified in the affected population. And so when I say that, that's currently an ongoing piece of work by Prof. Ramasar and Dr. Robia Bello. So they're busy looking into that at the moment. But so far, we haven't really found anything, perhaps Prof has, that is genetically causing the disease, although we do suspect that there may be something. We're just using more advanced methods now to look at that. And the other thing is that extensive environmental etiologies have been explored. They've looked at food, they've looked at water, they've looked at soil, they've looked for various different pathogens, various different immunological causes, and they haven't found any of these to be causative of MJD. And so this is where we entered very ambitiously. We're going to solve this problem. And so that's sort of the space that we enter into now, where not a lot is known, but we propose, and Prof. Gibbon proposes, a multifactorial etiology. Now, 100 years ago, a lot of the science looked at individual causes, but not necessarily how these causes interact with each other. And so that's sort of where our research is sort of going into. But what exactly is this disease? And why is it important? Who does it affect? We've done that, but what is it? So it's a bilateral uniform polyarticular osteoarthropathy, very clinically mouthy. But basically, as you can see from these x-rays, it affects the hip region and it results in joint degeneration. So if you're not clinically inclined, this is not normal. That is what a normal hip joint should look like. This is what the hip joint of an MJD patient looks like. So the disease is usually bilateral, and it results in severe joint and cartilage degeneration. And patients eventually adopt shuffling gaits and then rely completely on walking sticks until the disease progresses to the point where they're no longer actually able to move their hips at all, and then they're bedridden. And so Prof. Gibbon did an interesting genetic study where patients were actually carried in by their family into the study because they couldn't walk. And in a very rural area where there are no roads, wheelchairs aren't a very good option for patients. And other interesting thing about this disease is the possible link with brachydactylous dwarfism. And so brachydactylous dwarfism is a rare type of dwarfism, and it occurs in this area. It's a dwarfing phenotype. It's rare. It affects 0.1% of the population in the region. And it's a very mild form of dwarfism associated with epiphyseal dysplasia of the hips, knees, ankles, epiphyses, and it results in short and thick metacarpals and metatarsals. Now, this has been associated, this dwarf structure, with MJD. However, there are a lot of hypotheses about where this link could be. And unfortunately, my study was not really powered to look at that, but it's definitely something of future interest. And so in doing a lit review, we looked at the prevalence of MJD as it was known. So I began this study in 2019, and when I did my lit review, here we go. When I did my lit review, we noticed that the last time the prevalence of MJD was assessed was in 1985. So for some context, in South Africa, that was prior to the end of apartheid, prior to a lot of changes happening in the healthcare system. And what the study found was that women were at least 3 times more at risk of MJD than men. And the other consequences of this condition that were detected was that there was a very high school dropout rate in affected families. So the socioeconomic consequences were also notable. And the reason for this is largely because the area is reliant on subsistence farming. And so if a parent gets MJD, children often have to forego school to take care of their family. And this burden is felt most notably by women, because the gender partitioning of labor in that community is still very patriarchal. So very few females in families actually have education. But also the particularly concerning thing is that there appears to be an onset of MJD in childhood and adolescence. Now, given the fact that this is a degenerative disease, this is particularly concerning because in the adult population, this means that it's going to result in high levels of disability as the disease progresses. And in the absence of a good treatment plan or good preventative strategy, this is particularly concerning. And so the current treatment for MJD comprises what they call a step treatment plan. So most patients will be started on step 1, and then only if step 1 doesn't work do they then progress to step 2. But as you can see, none of these are really good options. Pain medication, there are lots of contraindications. Physiotherapy it's good, but the problem is that there's a very low adherence because patients don't actually show up at the clinic. And there are various reasons for that, which we found in the study. And the other thing is also surgery. So total joint replacements, by the time they're undertaken, the patient is already severely disabled. So they very rarely experience a full functional recovery. And there are very long waiting lists. I think the waiting list, based on the amount of patients that need it, is currently 2 years. And the patients that are prioritized are the ones that are the most disabled at that point. And so one of the issues is that in the area, there's limited access to healthcare, with the average distance to a clinic, the patient's local clinic, estimated to be 13 kilometers. And this is skewed by the fact that the majority of the community actually lives very close to the clinic and the main hospital. So there are individuals who live far further than that. In fact, they actually have a helicopter that they use to take doctors to one of the areas to see patients once a month. And so obviously with this limited access to healthcare, we see latent care seeking. So we see very delayed diagnosis of patients. And so this is sort of basically what we found in the review of the literature, which is very depressing. And it's a lot of things that need to be fixed and changed. And so where do we begin? So the first thing that we wanted to do was look at risk factors of MJD. What are the causes of MJD? And so in doing this, we first wanted to obtain an updated estimate of prevalence. We wanted to identify any temporal changes in the pattern of the disease. And we also wanted to look at environmental and socioeconomic risk factors in the region. And so we did this through a medical record review. So we did consider a large old school epidemiological survey, but given that the area spans about 10,000 kilometers and financial costs and personnel costs, it's quite a limiting factor. So the best way we thought of doing this was doing a medical record review. When we got to the hospital, we realized that they don't have an electronic medical record system. So we had to wade through, I think, over 10,000 medical records, which was not feasible. So we chose a particular period of time. So we looked at 2019 and we looked at July 2019, which is one of the busiest months for hips and joints in the area. And the reason for this is because of the cold weather. Patients report feeling more pain, and so they're more likely to go and seek care. And so we looked specifically at the population of at risk, and that means individuals who are from the affected area, were Bantu language speakers, meaning that they speak Zulu or I don't know what the other language spoken there, but it was mostly Zulu that we found. I think it was like Setswana, something else. And then, so that was a medical record review to obtain an updated prevalence. We then also conducted a meta-analysis where we compared our medical record data to the data that had previously been found. And as you can see, there were 29 articles pertaining to the prevalence of MJD that were identified, but only 4 of those had any information about prevalence or any statistics or any methods that were reported. So I'm happy to fashion anyone with my inclusion and exclusion criteria because it was quite tight. And then we also conducted a series of socio-ecological surveys. So that was, we used convenience sampling for this. So we just went to the hospital and spoke to affected and unaffected people. We asked them questions about the community, their lifestyle, the disease, if they knew about the disease. And then we compared all of this to census data. So this is sort of the methods. I'm going to report the results in a far more concise way, but this is where the data came from if you have any questions. Okay, so the results from our medical record review were quite interesting. So we estimated a point prevalence of 9%. So we looked at over 1,000 records and we screened them. I think it was 1,403. And out of that, only 723 individuals were the population at risk. So in defining this, we also included individuals below the age of 10 because the youngest case of MJD was detected in a 10-year-old. And so what we found firstly was that the disease was more prevalent in women than men, and that female gender was associated with a twofold increase in the likelihood of us finding MJD. We also found that in those older than 40 years of age, the likelihood of having MJD increased twofold. We believe might have been skewed by the fact that the majority of MJD patients are very, very old. But I'll discuss that a little bit more later. And so we then decided, in looking at the demographic risk factors, we would prioritize gender first, because we understood that the disease was experienced differently by men and women. And so we conducted medical records and a meta-analysis, and we combined that data and we looked at it together. And we found that there was an increased risk of MJD associated with female gender. And we also noticed the odds of MJD in women declined temporally from 1973 to 2019, except for the study by McLaren, as you can see there. But that study used a very different sampling strategy. And so it snuck through our inclusion criteria, but I probably wouldn't have included it, to be honest, but it did make it through. And so we saw that there was a temporal decline in the odds of MJD associated with gender, and we kind of see that our study fits in line with the other studies, although we do note that there was quite a difference in sampling strategy. And then when we looked at age, we found that there were no cases in patients younger than 35 years of age. And this was quite interesting to us because the youngest case of MJD has been detected youngest cases were detected in children, and we weren't finding any cases in children or adolescents. And so temporally, we determined from our analyses that there was an increased risk of MJD associated with aging. And so there are various different hypotheses that we have about this. One of them is that MJD is affected an aging cohort, but that's not necessarily why. But we had a lot of debates while we were at the hospital about these results, but that it was a group of individuals exposed to a risk factor that have now aged. Because we're not seeing a great detection rate in young individuals. Other factors like the HIV epidemic killing off a large portion of the population at a certain period of time may also be skewing this. So this is something that was very interesting and I think needs to be explored more. So when we looked at the geographic localization of MJD, so district number 5 in the cross with the circle in it, that's the Mseleni Hospital. And what we were finding was that the majority of patients that we were detecting with MJD were around the Mseleni Hospital, except for a large pockets of patients which were up north. So we then plotted that we were interested by this because the results normally suggest there's a higher prevalence around the hospital. So we were wondering if there's something unique in that area that's perhaps causing it. So we then plotted the data according to roads. And what we found was that the majority of patients were being detected along main tarred roads, suggesting the access to the hospital was severely different in different areas in the region. And this was likely affecting the type of patients that we were detecting. But we also wanted to see if there were any associations with water sources, because this has been hypothesized as a cause. And one of the things we noted is that, as you can see in number C, is that areas where MJD was most prevalent were most reliant on water from rivers, and that piped water was also prevalent in those areas. Sorry, let me say that again. That was definitely not correctly said. The wards with the greatest prevalence frequencies did not have extensive water pipelines. So that's what we were seeing, is that patients in the areas where MJD were most prevalent were also relying still on river water, meaning that they didn't have great access to piped water. And so we then wanted to explore this finding a little bit further. So why is the highest prevalence within the vicinity of the Mseleni hospital? So we looked and we compared our data to the previous data, and we found that this is in agreement with what the previous studies in our meta-analysis also found. And then we also looked at the geographic and geospatial regions, and this is quite interesting to me. So we found largely that MJD was localized to an area called the Sand Forest Zone. And so that's marked here in green. And so the Sand Forest Zone is a white sandy area with very nutrient deficient soil. So it's a unique biome that only exists in this area. And I think there's another area somewhere in Southern Africa. But the Sand Forest Zone was where it was largely prevalent. We also found, and this area is also characterized by a low canopy of abundant dense thickets and shrubs, but the area, even though it's very nutrient deficient, it's a very good source of food, traditional medicine, and building materials for local people. And I just thought I'd include some pictures of what that area looks like if you've not been there before. And so we have found something unique about the environment. We also wanted to then see if there was perhaps a life way, what we call life ways as biological anthropologists, or lifestyle. We wanted to look at life ways and see if perhaps there were any life ways associated with MJD. And so we found that, and so this was quite a rough analysis, but we looked at the food source in the past and present reported by people, transport sources in the past and present reported by patients with MJD versus unaffected individuals. And we found that there was no significant association between MJD and water source in the past and present, or access to electricity in the past. But we did find that MJD was associated with limited access to monetary income, public transport, and formal dwellings that individuals had experienced during childhood. So that's sort of how we defined past. We asked when you were a child versus now, because time and the way that patients in the area speak about time is very different than the way we would speak about it in the city. And so we found that largely patients had experienced what they refer to as an improved quality of living based on development. And 75% of patients cited improvements in these factors through time. And our study also found that there was a reduction in subsistence farming in those individuals. So they were more reliant on monetary income now, and that's likely to also be linked to age, because many of the patients are old, and also be linked to the fact that they can no longer farm. Yeah, so that's a lot of information. What does it mean? So that was the conclusion from that we found that there was a declining prevalence with time. We found a temporal risk in women and younger patients declined. We found a higher prevalence in sand forest zone and regions with limited pipe water supply. We also note, and I want to note that there's a practice of head loading to collect water, so carrying water by head, and that's very common. And so that also decreased with time as reported by patients. And so that's likely to place strain on the joints that are affected, but it's unlikely to be the sole cause of MJD. But it certainly is something that contributes to the experience of the disease. And also we did note that there was a bit of detection bias because there was a highest prevalence along the main transport routes. I'd never been to Mseleni before, and it's just some sort of images that I took when I was there, and this sort of began to spark a few more questions, and this is sort of like the evolution of the research journey that I'm talking about. And so we've done the quantitative stuff, and we found a whole bunch of things, but we were wondering, how do patients actually experience and understand this disease? Because that obviously is affecting the way that they're pursuing care. And when we visited to collect data, we noticed that there was a great disparity between the sanitized biomedical space where doctors operated, where we conducted interviews, as well as the space where the patient lived. And given the vast differences in the experiences between these two worlds, we believe that there was also likely to be differences in the beliefs surrounding the disease between these worlds. And so we set out to investigate local and cultural views and understandings of MJD and treatment seeking. And so myself and my translator here, we had a few home visits where we conducted a series of interviews, and from that we conducted analyses. And we were specifically interested in something called explanatory models. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with them, but I'm going to just briefly explain what they are. They were first described by Arthur Kleinman in 1989, and it's refers to ways that individuals conceptualize, experience, and explain illness. And it also refers to the expectations of their illness, and it affects their healing goals and their treatment-seeking behaviors. And so we were interested to see what these were. So if you see my little person here, just for some explanation, is that an individual experiences an illness within this world, this little square, where there are various different factors that affect the way that they experience, comprehend, and understand this illness, but also the way that they're going to pursue healing and treatment. And so in understanding the patient's explanatory model, we wanted to examine explanatory models and treatment-seeking behaviors held by patients, but also Western biomedical healthcare providers. So doctors and nurses at the hospital. So we conducted a series of interviews with patients, doctors, and nurses about the experience of the disease. And then we conducted a thematic analysis. So our study was mixed methods, meaning that we combined methods, not necessarily just quantitative methods. We did a meta-analysis, medical record review. So that's not what I mean by mixed methods. Mixed methods is where you combine qualitative and quantitative data, both of which speak to very different paradigms of a problem. So you can use both of them to study a problem, but they provide a very different view of the problem. And so we used our qualitative data to inform our themes, our quantitative data to inform the way that we approached our qualitative analysis. And we used it to develop some of the themes that we were going to explore further. And so that sort of process that we used is called triangulation. We had a purposive sampling strategy where we recruited patients for interviews who had sought care at the hospital for more than 5 years. So they had what would be referred to as more extensive and chronic treatment histories. We conducted in-depth interviews with 6 patients, 7 nurses, and 9 doctors, and interviews lasted from 20 minutes to 3.5 hours. They were very long. Specifically the doctors, they like to talk. So informed consent was obtained for all participants, and we also conducted interviews with patients in their language of choice, which was always Zulu. And for doctors, we also gave them the same option, and nurses, and that was English, which already speaks to you a bit about cultural disparity prevalent between these two groups. And then we conducted a thematic analysis within a pragmatist paradigm, where I don't know if you're familiar with pragmatism, but it's a philosophy of thought. So I guess it's like an epistemology. I don't know if I said that correctly, but it's basically, it sidesteps the contentious issues about truth and fact, and sort of just says, there's a problem. How are we going to study this problem? What is the best way to study this problem? And that is the approach that we used here. And our findings were fascinating. We found that there were great disparities between the way that patients and doctors describe this disease. Patients largely invoke supernatural, natural, and social causalities or explanatory models. In other words, they describe the causes as being witchcraft, largely nutritional deficiencies, soil, water, and social practices. And we found that there was overlap between patients and doctors in that both of them had described witchcraft as a cause of MJD. And And this is fascinating to us, but it wasn't completely unexpected because the majority of the nurses at the hospital are actually locals to the area, whereas the doctors who work at the hospitals train in the cities and they travel up into this area to work as doctors. And then doctors obviously invoked environmental and social explanatory models, which are very biomedical in nature. And nurses invoked EMs that were common to both doctors and patients, almost emphasizing the fact that they were branching these two very different ways of thinking about an illness. And so, yes. Okay. And so we developed a series of themes. So we conducted a thematic analysis to assess themes and ask about patients and doctors what they thought was causing MJD. And one of the interesting findings was that patients were largely citing soil as the cause of MJD in their discussion. Here's a quote, one of the patients. And so this was something that was fascinating to us. And exploring this further, we realized that patients were describing soil as a cause, not necessarily, as scientists, we think that it's likely to be chemical. There must be a chemical, a pathogen, something in the soil that's causing the disease. But the patients were largely using soil to describe several things. Number one, the sand in the area, which is particularly soft. And this links into what we found out with the sand forest zone having the greatest prevalence. Patients largely reported feeling pain when they were walking. So they're likely describing cause based on when they were feeling pain, like what was causing my pain is what is causing my disease, which is very different from the way that we tend to look at it in biomedicine, as we tend to be very mechanism focused. And the other thing I was going to say about soil is that there's a very, in a lot of locals, soil has a very, almost a spiritual significance to an area, a home. And so a lot of locals often said it's a disease of the soil, in that it's a disease of the land, it's a disease of this people. And so they use that to describe their perception of causation. And the other thing that we found is that a lot of patients accessed traditional medicine prior to biomedicine. And we were the first to report this practice in treating MJD, which is Taba, which I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, but it's a practice of cutting at a painful joint. So if you have a painful joint, you would cut, or a traditional healer would cut and place medicinal herbs in that wound, because there's something obviously in that blood. So to me, it speaks back to sort of the humoral theories, bleeding to get rid of something that's causing the disease. Anyway, and so what we found that patients were seeking care before at traditional healers prior to Western healers was not unique to this disease. We've seen it with HIV, we've seen it with TB. But what it does tell us, next slide, what it does tell us is that both of these paradigms of healing provide the patient with a degree of comfort, whether it be spiritual comfort or physical comfort, and a source of healing and relief from illness. And so the conclusion from this was that the perception of causation and approaches to care seeking are influenced by various factors in one's frame of reference, and that the local community plays a role in how knowledge is created and disseminated, as well as the beliefs about causation, which we do know. And then the other thing that we sort of found was quite important, emphasizing in this region in the future, is that given the movement in South Africa towards national health insurance, it's very important for us to include community-centered care through inclusion of community leaders, traditional healers, and patients, because obviously this use of traditional care and healing is very common in the area. So how can we, almost as biomedical practitioners, use this to improve patient outcomes, especially given the fact that we're moving towards this new NHI bill? Anyway, so I would just like to finish off by thanking the Mseleni community, my PIs, Associate Professor Gibbon and Dr. Robia Vallo, as well as Dr. Fredland for his long life commitment to the people of MJD and our funders. And this is a time for questions if anyone does.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. That was fascinating, stimulating, and a wonderful example of looking at a public health problem from lots of different perspectives, triangulate insights. Really wonderful. I'll open the floor to questions. We probably have about, let's say 15, 20 minutes absolutely. Steve.
Thanks for a fascinating presentation. So I used to work in that area and on the Uganda Mountains, actually at the same hospital that Landon's grandfather used to work.
Oh, wow.
I'm mentioning the history because one of the theories is that post-Second World War, the area was saturated with DDT to get rid of tsetse fly.
Yes.
And that the theory is that it's dying out now because there was this environmental toxin that what's the word? What happened?
Saturated or
that came down specifically to Lakes Byron, rain to Lakes Byron. And that's why it is geographically situated there. So I wanted to know if you're questioning might have mentioned that whether their grandfathers, grandmothers, or great-grandfathers or great-grandmothers had the same illness. In other words, was it a sudden, relatively sudden incidence, or has it been going back more generations? So that's my question. The other comment is, why are people all situated on Tara Road? It's very obvious to me, having practiced in that area, there's a lot of disabled people ask their families to actually move their whole homestead to be close to a road, either a dirt road or a tar road. There's only one in that area. Because it's difficult, impossible to use wheelchairs, sand. It's even difficult to use crutches. So even early on in the disease, when they see this is coming, people move their whole family to be either close to the hospital. We saw a lot of that, so we have a lot of disabled people quite close to us, or near the tar road so that they can see. So that seems to be a obvious reason. Anyway.
In fact, let me speak to that first and also say that around the hospital, the infrastructure is also a lot better developed. So there's also running water and there's electricity.
And the road's tarred all the way to the hospital.
Exactly. So I think that's also another reason that people tend to be living in that area. But also there are a lot of jobs. So a lot of the local community works at the hospital, either as a nurse or cleaning or managing in admin. And so that's sort of more the economic center in the area, and then the bigger towns a little bit further away. But the other thing I wanted to talk about was the DDT hypothesis, because that was something that I wanted to mention, but I thought I don't want to confuse everyone because it is quite a complex thing. So for everyone else, the first interviews that were done in 1985, they asked patients, what is the first recollection you have of this disease in the area? And everyone answered there was no recollection or no collective memory of the disease prior to the 1900s. And the 1900s was characterized as a time when people saw the first aeroplanes coming in the area, and that's how they described it. There was the first time that there were airplanes in the area, and that was when spraying with DDT was practiced. So I know that they have tested the water for various different toxins, but they haven't found something, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the water in Lake Sabai is not causing it.
It's not just the water, they've also checked all of the soil.
Yes.
All of the soils have been checked for any toxins, and they've run animal model studies.
Yes. So that being said, though, it is also possible that there may be an epigenetic cause, something that was caused by exposure, which has been retained in the genome through time.
But then the second part of this question was the part of the questionnaires around family histories, which doesn't align. So I can't remember if you asked that in yours,
Yeah.
but I certainly asked it in my questionnaires.
Yeah.
And there was no association or not a discrete association with familial histories of exposure or to the disease themselves. It was fun.
So we also, to do that, we also wanted to find out if the individuals that we were sampling, if they were all from the area, because the movement of people is quite common, and someone from this area will marry and move to her husband's area. So I don't know, she might not have the disease, but her husband's always lived there. So we wanted to understand the movement of people as well. And so we found that a lot of people's, so a lot of women weren't staying in the area that they were born. A lot of men had still stayed in the area that they were born. And we found that we did find that some patients remembered great-grandparents and grandparents having MJD, but it was also, we realized that this might be obviously affected by memory. But my translator and I also realized that a lot of patients were answering based on, is this person alive? So if the person was no longer alive, they were like, no, they don't have it. Not, they didn't have it. And so that was something that just a nuance in communication that we also had to be aware of. But it's definitely something perhaps Prof. Ramasar can explore in the future with this DNA work.
Maybe for the epigenetic.
Alex.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So maybe just to piggyback off that question, if there were any mention in the interviews about people noticing fewer cases of MJD amongst younger people in the community as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we asked patients about it, when we asked young patients about, or young people at the hospital who didn't have MJD, they actually laughed because they're like, no, that doesn't affect us. That's an old person's disease. And it was very funny, the disparity between age. So the LC would say, no, it doesn't affect the enlightened ones, as they refer to the younger patients. And the older patients, said it didn't affect the enlightened ones, and the younger patients said it's mostly a disease of old people. So from our interviews, we also found that was sort of, the trend was noted.
And on that note, also that Victor Fredlin, who had worked there for his entire career, I don't know, 35, 40 years at the hospital, he's the one who told us that there's a decline in that they're seeing fewer and fewer people coming in with this, and that's also why we did a new prevalence study, and the results also support that.
Yeah. And that was also quite interesting because he did say, if young people are developing it, they're certainly not coming in for it, which might even speak to a change in the severity of onset. So they were having a lot of young people who could barely walk. And so if young people do have the disease, they're not developing it as quickly, was another hypothesis. So we might not detect them when they're 18 now, we might only detect them when they're 14. And the reason that we think that is because of the environmental changes. So labor in the area has changed, head loading, water collecting, because of the prevalence of food and shops in the area now. People are no longer having to plow their own fields, collect their own water. So we think that might be affecting the rate of onset.
And I think so those are socioeconomic changes, but it's also what we said about the sand is if you're not head loading and walking on very loose sand, you're also not having the same impact on and you're not subsistence farming. So that also leads to that onset much later. Can I add one thing too that I also think is interesting is when I did my questionnaires, almost everybody said associated onset with birth of their children.
Yeah.
And this is something that I asked Liz to look into because obviously with childbirth, there's all of these hormonal changes and biological changes in the body. Is it being triggered by that? And one of the findings from Liz's study actually confirms that it has nothing really to do with childbirth, but rather the memory of stages of life. Oh, it was around the time, I had so-and-so or my firstborn. So we can't actually make that direct association. But we are looking into, like Dr. Ballo, I think she might be online here somewhere. But she is looking at the cartilaginous and bone development in a cell model. So we'll find out. Watch this space.
Raj, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, so during our visit to Mseleni in the 90s, and my predecessor Peter Biden had been there several times before that, and looked at this, and he's an expert in skeletal disorders, not just inherited skeletal disorders. So it was reasonably obvious to us. I mean, the argument for genetics is that there was a strong familiarity. So although there was the classic Mendelian, child, whatever, there was a clustering in groups and subgroups of this, as well as and in addition to that, I mean, there was a description of the disorder as being something heterogeneous. It's not the same, what's called Mseleni disease, Mseleni Joint Disease. In fact, not one disease, but in fact, at least 3 different disorders. The stuff you see going on in the brachydactylus dwarf. The original assumption was that was a recessive form of whatever else was affecting the rest of the community as MJD. Then there was something called protrusio that was characterized by protrusio acetabular. And the third one was the kind of hip degeneration you see in SCT. So they were trying. The feeling is there's evidence that there are at least 3 phenotypes. And we've not looked at it that classically in the past. We're certainly doing that now. So that's from a genetics point of view. And I think what is also quite important, though, is to bear in mind that this is not either genetic or environment, but actually both. Yeah. This is a combination of both. And the argument for that is potentially environmental exposure that's in fact being depleted over time. But the remnants of the phenotype, for example, are left in groups and certain groups because of the genetic predisposition somewhere in the genome. So that's the angle we're taking at the moment with regards to doing. Previously, we looked at it in Romeo was my first PhD student. So in that era, we looked at like 1 or 2 or 3 candidate genes at a time, whereas now we're looking at across the whole genome. And we may pick up nothing, but this certainly warrants with your kind of work you've done previously and find some anything of here with this kind of information, what we're picking up genetically and understanding of the environmental exposure, etc. All of those hypotheses, revisiting that environment and looking at exactly what is going on. I think that is warranted.
Absolutely.
What we've been exploring. Thank you. Fantastic work.
Thanks, Rob.
Just as a clarity, this is medical anthropology. I know we've said biological anthropology. This really does fall in that center.
Yeah.
Questions or comments from the floor? Steve?
Sorry, just another comment. This is one of the few areas where there's still leprosy. And this discussion is reminding me of the real clustering of leprosy as well, which has made us think that there's some genetic predisposition. It's obviously nowadays controlled largely by, the spread is controlled by on drugs. And so the incidence is dying out. It just strikes me that it's a very familiar theme. Although it's an infectious disease, things are very complex. It might have been something that was settled at a certain time in history that was possibly infectious in nature, and certain families had a predisposition the same way that we understand leprosy.
And also there's a lot of mind that has happened. The 1950s, 1960s, that area was extensive in mind. So there was also a lot of
Steve, listening to your comment, it reminds me of the epidemiologic triad of age, period, and cohort. You understand the disease distribution at a particular point in time as a function of the age of the population, the decades through which they've lived, but also cohort effects like what we're describing. That's fascinating.
If I may also add, sorry, it's just for everyone who's studying populations that they may not be familiar with. It is immensely helpful to go and immerse yourself, something Vicky and I have been talking about lately, in the community, and even just staying there for a week, you suddenly realize like how dry the soil is, and you know how difficult life is there, and it sparks so many hypotheses about, for us, like so many hypotheses. It literally created this new branch of research that we decided to explore. Yeah, it was very, very helpful.
Yeah, you know, the way you described, you mentioned the aggravate effect of that terrain. That is, without experiencing it, you think, well, it's a big deal. But actually, if you actually walk on that sand, you see how difficult it is.
Yes.
And you see these from walking with the two walking sticks. And
Yeah.
many of them being wheel arrow into clinic.
Yes.
And you start to understand the search for getting onto the tar road.
Yeah.
On pests.
Also for locals, like the understanding of how far something is so different. I remember I did an interview with a patient who couldn't walk. She was using a walker, and so we drove somewhere. And I was very grateful for my translators and my guides because they knew where to go. I had no clue where to go, and you're just driving on dirt roads, and you turn left onto another dirt road, left onto another dirt road, and eventually in the middle of nowhere, and you have no clue where you are and how to get back. And we got out the car and he said, okay, it's just a short walk. And we walked for like 5 kilometers, carrying like food and like a whole bunch of things for this person. But it was just a short walk. And so understanding also how individuals in the area perceive something very differently from the way that we do was also very helpful. Now, any other questions or comments?
Mike.
So you said that this is a unique ecosystem, and there were maybe one other place in Southern Africa that has this ecosystem. So I have a couple of questions related to that. Anybody look in that other area? And then the other thing is, so if you also mentioned that there's particular herbs that maybe are used in traditional medicine, has anybody looked at herbs and whether or not there's an association for that? And do women more than men? I mean, the environmental, if it's a gene environment interaction, then what the environmental part of it is I guess,
Yes.
open question.
Absolutely. So just the environmental fact, the sand forest zone. So it spreads northwards up from, I think, that is Simangaliso Wetland Park. So it spreads north up of that, all the way, I think, into the middle of Mozambique. So that's the area, as far as I'm aware. And it's just very dry and barren. And it's sort of hot and it's dry and it's humid. That's from the literature, what I understand is what makes it unique, is that generally a humid area will be very lush in vegetation, whereas this, because of the hills and stuff, is humid, but it's not very lush and it's still very dry. And so as far as I'm aware, no one's really looked at the other area to see if there is a similar disease. However, there are some other areas in South Africa where, I mean, I'll just briefly say there's been something similar possibly proposed in Lesotho. But it's sort of, I mean, that's maybe something we need to follow up on. The idea of that is still very in its infancy. They've discovered something that they think might be similar to MJD, but there are also some other conditions. But in India, called Dinkele joint disease and Cash-and-Beck disease. Now, both of those have known etiologies, but what is similar is the fact that it affects this endemic population, this group of people that are very geographically isolated, and it still is geographically isolated, despite population movement. Yeah, and then I see your hand. Is it related to this? Because I want to about gender.
Yeah, no, I was going to say also the other hospitals on both sides which are still in the sand zone, do not have the same frequency of the disease at all. So there is certainly a concentration in the incident area. And so it peters out a lot as you go into Mseleni. So it's not, so it is geographically confined to that ecozone, but it's also geographically confined within that.
Yeah. And then also if there are patients who do develop MJD up at that hospital, which is Manguzi or Bethesda, they do get referred to the Mseleni Hospital. So we would have detected them in our interview. The other thing I just wanted to note was your comment about gender and possible foraging differences in men and women. So no one that we are aware of has looked at the drugs, possible traditional medicine drugs, not really drugs, but the compounds used to treat MJD in the area. So that's definitely something that would be interesting and needs further exploration. But there are differing labor practices between men and women. So we did see that there was a higher prevalence in women than men, but it's very circular migratory practices or circular migration, which is called or migrant labor practices are still very common. So a lot of men work in Johannesburg or in Durban and then travel back. So we do think that if they do have MJD, we're not really detecting them in our study. However, in the city, those men are not being detected either. And so they're not being written up and not being reported as unique diseases either.
Right. And I in the earlier paper in 2010, I did hypothesize that actually by leaving as circular migrants, they are leaving exposure to some kind of environmental trigger. And because they're only returning home for short periods of time. And also, and like Liz says, it's not like we're capturing them in Johannesburg Hospital, it's presenting. So it does seem as though by leaving the community that they are escaping some kind of environmental trigger, whereas the women who are being but men who experience the disease as children often did not leave because they were disabled young and weren't able to do heavy physical labor, and they ended up staying in it. They're also retained in kids.
The other thing I wanted to just note, which came up in interviews, which was very interesting and not something we could really further explore, was that there's a very big trade of medicines, like illegal trade of medicines in the area. So the doctor that we interviewed expressed a lot of concern about the fact that their patients are buying medicine at taxi ranks, like drugs, like tablets of different colors. And so then when the patients show up at the hospital and want care and want treatment, they'll say, well, I bought 2 blue ones and I bought a red one because they said that those ones will help. And so then they have no idea what medication the patient's taken. And so a few of them actually even got on a taxi one day to just see what was happening. And yeah, so they said it was very concerning. Like a guy just took out his big Ziploc bag and like, what's wrong with you? Okay, here's 2, and was selling medicines like that informally. So that's also something that would be interesting to look at. I don't know how, but yeah.
But to answer also the question about the herds, culturally, the people in this region are not unique. We're all along the eastern KZN coast. So there could be a herd compound, but also there may not be. And a lot of research was done on those kinds of things earlier.
And if I may say one last thing.
One last thing, yeah.
And that the area, Fabuyalingan, is specifically known as the area where traditional medicine commonly used in KZN is harvested from. And so it's known as like the area having the strongest traditional medicine by locals. So a lot of people will actually travel to that area if they're sick. And I know there are some traditional healers that literally have like hostels where you can stay with them until you get better, which is also fascinating and something I wanted to look at further, but just didn't have time. So it's very well known for having strong routine.
Fabulous, fabulous. Colleagues, we're out of time. So Elizabeth, thank you again very much. Clearly much more to talk about, but much more work going on. So this is one installment in what will be a running series on Mseleni joint disease and its epidemiology and pathogenesis and genetics and so forth. Elizabeth, thank you again. Victoria, thanks. And colleagues, thanks. And colleagues online, thank you very much. We'll see you next week at the noon meeting.